This is the show that helps you know what to quit, what to keep, and what to question. Welcome to the QuitCast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the QuitCast. Today, we are talking about one of the Clifton Strengths themes, and we have three amazing high communication writers on the show today. So I want to get to them as quickly as possible. So let's go check out what Terry and Becca have to say about what communication looks like as a strength, and then how we can use it as a writer. So take it away, Terry and Becca.
Is how would you explain communication to somebody who doesn't have it?
Ooh, I would say, do you know Becca Syme? And then I would say, Becca Syme will really need to talk some days. And she'll say, can we just talk for you got 10 minutes? I'll be like, yeah, absolutely. And then we talk, and then it's not 10 minutes. It's going to need to be a little bit longer. I know that. That's a joke.
Why is that?
Communication is about. So when I think of communication, I think of it's the talent that manifests as verbal. It's the verbal way of communicating. I know when we talk about intellection, they prefer to do it quiet and type or write their thoughts. But to me, communication is all of their thoughts need to be verbalized. Not need to be, but that's the way they best communicate, right? And they also have a higher awareness of other people in that medium. They watch for visual cues. They see if they're being understood. And they also have it's a need to be understood. So every time they're talking or interacting with people, they feel a strong desire or need to be fully understood. So they'll want to say the right thing. They'll want to make sure that it lands with people, and they'll gauge that from them. And it can be frustrating sometimes as well, but that's what I think of when I think of communication, the ability to verbally interact and communicate with people.
The way Gallup used to teach this, which I think is super interesting, that I don't hear it as much from them as we used to, but they used to say that communication doesn't have to be verbal. And I think the reason they do that is because every once in a while you get a communication who is like, let's say, high intellection or high context or something. Right. And then they're like, but I don't like to talk the way like a woo communication would like to talk, for instance. And so they're always saying like communication doesn't have to be verbal. It could be dance. It could be painting. It could be something. But I would say it is expressive, though. Communication in all of its forms is expressive. And I have yet to meet a high communication who's not verbally expressive. But for some reason, Gallup's always saying like, it doesn't have to be verbal. It can be written, which is where we get all communication should think about being a writer thing, which we joke about all the time.
Yeah.
That they say that, because I'm like, no, most writers are low in communication.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that I know why they probably say it for the odd person that doesn't feel included by that verbal thing. But definitely it's a talent like any other that relies on the others' talents a person has. But I'm the same. I've coached, I can't think of a single communication that I've coached, even more quiet or introverted or circumspect, that wants to think about things. Absolutely, a lot. But once they start to warm, or once they feel comfortable, or they really have an idea that they've thought about, it comes out verbally. It's very much verbal. And that's what I agree with you.
Yeah, the expression part, and the reason that Gallup talks a little bit more about the expression is because you will sometimes have a musician or a dancer or a painter or a sculptor who has high communication, who considers the medium of their art to be the expression of their art. But more often, and what you'll see in the talk show, in the writer's talk show, more often what you see is people who care a lot about how words are put together. They care about the way things get said because there's a message that they want to communicate somehow. So the dance or art or whatever could also be a communication of that message, but then it's the message that's important. It's the expression of the message. And then how you tell is a communication whether the message is coming across or not, whether it's landed, is the feedback loop. And all communication people have some kind of a feedback loop.
Right. And that's what I was saying earlier, that it's always that visual medium, that visual feedback to know if their message has been seen. So I can see that absolutely applying with any visual medium art or dance or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because I see it with you a lot, and we talk about it a lot, how communications can get that feedback. And so that's, I think, that portion of it, maybe not the verbalizing, but the needing feedback. Because even quieter communication people will probably, if they think about it, rely on that seeing someone or getting that feedback in a certain way to know if their message has landed.
Or
right?
hearing, right? Like it might be verbal or it might be auditory, but it's definitely a checking in. It's a feedback of some kind. And they do talk about like communications needing sounding boards, or I call it being dialogic, which of course is a input communication or a learner communication way of saying people like to have dialogue. Like the communication needs to say something, have it heard, have it processed and understood, and then have some kind of feedback process backwards so that I know if it's landing or not. And in a dialogue, it's very easy for me to know if I'm being understood or not as a communication person, because I can tell when you say something back to me, I can tell if you've understood what I was talking about or not. And then I can tell when I'm not reflecting back to you what you meant to say, right? Like I can tell when I'm mishearing or misunderstanding you as well.
I think an important part to add to what you just said is that's with practice. That it's with practice,
Right.
that you get a good gauge if people are understanding or not.
The overlap between a lot of the influencing strengths is the ability to tell if I'm having an impact or not, right? So it's a significance, command, activator, maximize, like all of the influencing strengths on some level have an ability to gauge that impact. And with communication, it's specifically about the message getting across. And the message should have some kind of an action or an understanding or something attached to it. But it's very much, and that's why a lot of communications are external processors. Because if you think about when I'm thinking in my head about what I want to say, and I'm kind of, let's say, having a dialogue in my head if I'm high communication, but I don't actually know how that's going to land until I say it out loud. And then I hear, what did I just say? How did Terry respond to me? What does it mean? What does all that process mean about whether my communication was effective or not? And then the important piece for communication is the reshaping. So if I realize that I have miscommunicated or that I've said something I don't mean, then I need to take all that information that I'm getting, that feedback, and reshape the message again and re-deliver, which is why you often hear communications repeat themselves when they'll say something slightly different than what they just said, trying to see if the message will land better if they say it that way. And sometimes it's so instinctive they don't even know they're doing it. And you'll hear it even in the author talk show. It's not always something we can control about ourselves, because it's so often the immediate response of like the light bulb or whatever going off that I can't control, that I'm looking for it. So that's one of the development edges of high communication, is working on how you control your need for things to land. So a lot of writers see their full 34, they notice that they don't have high communication. And because the words and the language around the communication talent are all about storytelling, they worry, if I don't have that strength, I'm not going to be able to be a good writer. And actually, one of the reasons we've waited so long to do the communication episode is specifically because I wanted to wait and let people see, oh, that storytelling capacity can come from here or from here or here. I can be a high strategic and like the landing of a story. I can be a high ideation and like that, right? So we could see that there were many places it could come from. It doesn't have to come from communication. And then it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a better storyteller than other people. just because you have high communication, because you might not be developing it if you have it as well.
One thing that we run into when I'm coaching high communication people is that they tend to say that they draft slower, or that they'll go over their lines more. They'll do a few paragraphs and then stop and want to go back and rewrite those things. And that's definitely an attribute of communication, because communication wants that clear and concise, crisp almost delivery of the perfect sentence. So that's typically something that we see as a common thing with high communication people, is they may not be the fastest drafters, but when their drafts are finished, they're very clean. You find that as well, right, Becca?
Oh yeah, almost to a point where, like, we definitely have some high communication writers who are like a book a year people. It's not necessary for that to be that way, because a lot of it depends on your personal style and what your own expectations are, and things like
Right.
that. But it wouldn't be uncommon to see a high communication drafter who would write on at a slower pace. What's super interesting is, depending on how much you've worked out that communication over time. So when we talk about the better, faster development, right, it's the consistent application of time and intention to an area where you have natural talent. So if you have been working on your communication so much over the years, and we see this a lot with people who are like, let's say 1, 2, or 3 communications, where they just have been honing and honing and honing. And so they might end up having some shortcuts for themselves about, like, oh, this is exactly what I want trope wise, or this is the style of character I write, or whatever it is that is a shortcut for them. But there absolutely is a possibility for communication to draft quicker if they've developed that communication.
Right.
But if you haven't, or if you need the verbal expression, because that's the other piece we see, like communications who get stuck in a book and don't talk about it to anybody. And they just sit there and try and figure it out on their own because it's my book and I'm supposed to figure this out on my own. And I know there was a lot of air quotes at one time, but like it's not your book because you talk about it with people. And especially if you're high communication, high woo, some of those more extroverted type of strength, right?
Yeah.
Like, the
Yeah.
best thing you can do as a communication is reach out to somebody and talk about why you're stuck, because you'll find out so much faster if you process it.
Yeah, it's not just the best thing you can do, it's a prescription. If you have communication in your dominant strengths, and you are surrounded by people that you don't share that you're writing with, if you don't have many people to talk to and you're high communication, you need to find someone to talk out loud to, because that alone could be stopping you from going further in your story, being happy with your story, or creating your story. And I'll say this as well, which Becca will never say, but it's a true thing for communication people. The less you want to talk, the more you probably need to talk to somebody. And then you'll feel much better after you do it. It's pretty much the equivalent of being hangry. When I'm hangry, I don't want to eat. And then after someone gets a chocolate bar in me or whatever, not anymore, but whatever, you're like, wow, I really did need to have a little something. But it's definitely that way with communication. Definitely. And I see that with Becca. Definitely when Becca starts to like not want to talk, then there's something she really needs to talk about. And then after she does get that talked about, it makes but it's helpful, right? Would you agree with what I just said? 100%, right?
Oh, it's totally right. Yeah. Like, it's literally the most true thing about a communication is that you should talk when you're stuck. Like, that's the most true thing. But it's frustrating for communication people, because most of us, like, so the barrier labels of communication are talks too much, won't let other people talk, doesn't listen, blabbermouth, right? Like, all of those barrier labels. And when you hear those barrier labels your whole life, and you are an audience reader, which communications are, you internalize them. You learn that, or you think you learn that people don't want to hear what you have to say, or they don't want to listen to you. Yeah. So when you have heard that most of your life, or like, you talk too much, go to your room, or you talk too much, leave me alone, or ghosting, right? Like those kinds of things, you learn that you shouldn't be talking as much as you are, that it's uncomfortable. And so then your compensation is, well, I'm just not going to bother people. I don't want to bother anybody, right?
Yeah.
And what I have learned over the years with my own stuckness as a high communication is, if I don't reach out as soon as I get stuck. And if I instead try to figure it out on my own, and sometimes it works for me to type it. Like I've learned on my Patreon that if I write out a chapter, and this just happened to me yesterday, if I write out a chapter of the book and I put it up on the Patreon and people start to have problems with it or they ask questions, then it helps me to shape the message. But I have been sitting on that chapter for a month, not writing it and trying to think about it. And instead, what I should have done is just sat down and written it and then, done what I did or talked to somebody about it. Like that would have helped.
Or videotape yourself or,
right.
Yeah. I mean, but definitely
It's
interaction's key.
It's why I do YouTube channel stuff, right? Like for me, all of the series that I've done on the YouTube channel, the burnout series, the writer's block series, the productivity series, the silver bullet series, like all the QTP series, all of those are me preparing to write about them because I say it out loud. I hear what I think. I hear how I process it. I hear the feedback, all the questions. And then I write a better book because I talked about it first.
I've been excited. Each one of these authors that I met, when we had our coaching call, I thought, and I think I may have even said out loud to all of them, we need to have you on the communication quick cast because what you just said is so communication. And so I feel like I love that. Having people who can just speak that language is so important. And I'm so excited about it, about this episode. So I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Jami Albright. I write romantic comedy, contemporary romance, and my communication is number 3.
I'm Sarah MacLean, and I write historical romances mainly, though sometimes I write something weird and extra. And I'm a 1 communication.
1 communication.
Hi, I'm Andie J, and I write contemporary romance and romantic comedies right now, and I'm a number 4 communication. But I'm a number 1 empathy, so I feel like that amplifies it.
It does. That's a good power pair. You're an empathy too, right, Jami?
Yeah, number 4.
Yeah, I'm like a 34 empathy.
Same, that's me.
31 or 32 or something. And I'm a 7 communication. And so the benefit of having all high communication people explaining what this strength looks like and how we use it in writing is that it's such an innate part of our process. And sometimes we're not even aware that we do the things that are communication. So it's so important to see that authentic response. And so, if you were to explain, and I'm going to start with Sarah.
Oh God.
Explain, I know, so much pressure to be first.
Right. I feel like you should explain it.
Well, but I think sometimes communications explain it better, right? Because you're explaining what you remember of it instead of like the Gallup definition. So if you were to explain communication, how would you tell another writer about it who has it?
It's funny that it's funny because I remember I did the same thing that you talk about in your book, where I read, oh, well, I'm a 1 communication. Of course I am. I'm a writer. Right. It just, naturally, I sort of assumed that was what we all are. And then you said, oh no, it's actually kind of weird for writers to be high communication. And I appreciated that because I do feel like communication requires an audience in some way and not the kind of audience that writers usually get, meaning writers usually finish the project and then get an audience. And I think high level communicators need a constant sense of feedback and interaction in order for us to feel like we're being successful in any way, which is a really difficult thing to do when you are a writer alone at your desk.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
100%.
So for me, I was unsurprised to discover that I was a high communication. I have a podcast. I spend most of it. Andie is on multiple text threads with me where I talk to large amounts of people constantly. But I would say that if you are high communication and a low focus like me, you have some hard times and I'm here for you.
Yeah.
We'll start a support group.
Right. I agree. I agree, because it can be really difficult. And I think one of the things, interestingly, when I first met Jami, so we met each other at a small writing conference, and we were talking about what her writing process had been like. And everybody was kind of chiming in about, like, you know, what their thoughts are, like we all do. We're trying to be helpful. And I said something to Jami, and I was like, how often are you getting out and talking to people? And she looked at me like I was nuts. She was like, that doesn't matter, Becca. Like, right? Not that she didn't say that, but that's what her body language said. She's like, you're a crazy person. Just take it elsewhere. And so I was like, no, it's okay. It's a communication thing. We forget how important that is for us to have somebody to try out our material on, right? Because Jami, you write comedy, right?
Yeah. And you know, it's just real quick. It's really funny because after that conversation, things started to click for me about that, because I worked in a hospital. I did hearing screening for newborns. So I would go from room to room to room, from nurse's station to nurse's station to nurse's station. And if something funny happened, I would tell one group of people, and if they laughed, I'd go, okay. Then I'd go to the next group of people and make it better and tell it better. And then by the time I left, that was the best story ever.
God,
ever,
we're
ever.
the worst.
We're the worst.
Or the best. Or the best. Or the best.
Yeah. But yeah. So it really clicked with me that, that's exactly what I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think we do that, like, right. No, go ahead, Andie.
I had a cockamamie idea today, and I was like, who can I tell this to?
It was me.
I told Kate Claiborne first. I did. And she was like, ooh, interesting. But you were like, yes.
Well, I think we get used to, as communications, knowing what we need. Like, I know what I need from an audience. Like, it's no shock that all of us are nodding a lot at each other when we're talking, because we're like, yes, this is what it looks like when you are landing, when your message is landing. And so you see that with communications. They'll often, their eyes are bright, you know, they look at you when you're talking to them, they nod, they give you feedback, because that's what communications use as a way to determine. So I was going to say, like, it could be jokes, right? But it could also be like empathy stories. It could be something like a shocking thing, right? Like I tell someone and I notice, oh, you got really surprised when I said that. So now my feedback mechanism, which is a communication thing, perks up and is like, ooh, that was a shocking way to tell that. So the reason that I made that comment to Jami was specifically because jokes need to land. And so as a writer, if I'm sitting in my room writing jokes, then I don't always know myself how they land. Like, sometimes I need that audience in order to know, like, did this hit the way that it should? And so, and that was one of the reasons I said that. And it was so funny because I didn't know she had communication yet. I mean, she hadn't taken the test, but I knew it from talking to her that she had that. And I'm like, you need an audience. You need an audience. And there's a communication writer out there listening to this who has had a similar experience where they stopped writing and they weren't able to, you know, get past a certain part. And it's because there's something that you don't know how it lands yet. So you need to keep talking about it with people or keep trying it out. So Jami, how would you explain communication to, like, another writer?
For me, it's being able to draw that word picture for people. And I get that a lot, like in reviews and things like that, you know, that's so funny. I could exactly see what happened. But yeah, I used to do stand up. So a lot of what I did was storytelling, and it was starting at the beginning and then realizing where the peaks and valleys were in that story and then landing the joke. And so, but yeah, for me, to me, somebody that has really good communication, I can see exactly what they're saying. Like, I can just visualize it. So
it's clear.
You know what I love about that, Jami, about the fact that you were a stand-up comedian, is this idea that I feel like when I do public speaking, and I do a lot of public speaking, you know, I feel like a good communication, a high communication person knows when they have the room. And so it is both super great because you know when you have the room and you know kind of where to hit it, to hit the joke or the, you know, the story, how to really tell the story in the room. But if you don't have the room, it feels like you are just, your whole life is over.
Right. That's so accurate, because your message doesn't land, right? Like, and you can tell.
Like I can remember I gave a talk at a conference, and going into it, I sort of thought like, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this conference. And I had said yes. And in the moment, I was like, I don't know if I'm the right fit. And I didn't have the room. And my publicist later was like, that was great. And I was like, I didn't have them.
Yeah.
Like, you just know.
Yeah.
You just know.
feel it. Yeah. You do.
Yeah.
You feel it.
I don't think anybody, I mean, there's some strategics that can do that sometimes, or some significances.
Well, I'm a too strategic too.
Right. But it's so a communication thing, because it's all about, like, you're reading their body language and you're seeing like how attentive are they, how checked out are they, how much do they light up when I say something. So I think that's a big piece of communication too. And it makes me wonder, well, and Andie, I'm interested to hear also how you describe it, because it makes me wonder if that also, if we do that in our writing, but we can talk about that in a second. But how would you describe communication to another writer?
Once I took the test and realized I was like a number 4 communication, it all kind of came together for me that one of my really good friends in college said that told me once that like my true gift was being able to distill for people.
Yes.
To take something really complex and make people able to understand it.
Yes.
Through talking to them.
Yep.
And so I think that's really what it is. And like, I've noticed, I think when we were talking, I was like, dating is really hard for me as a communication.
Yes.
Because I'm really good at talking to people. And also I'm an empathy, so I know how they feel about me.
Yes. Yes. I remember that conversation too, because I was like, oh my gosh, it's so hard as a communication because you can read everything.
And also I'm pretty strategic. So I'm like, this isn't going to work. And I know why.
Yeah. Well, and then why continue
for the
at that
appetizer,
point, right? I can't remember if it was you, but I think it might have been where we talked about the lemon law, where I was like, I love the idea of the lemon law, where like you get 5 minutes and you're like, yeah, let's just walk away. Like, we're just done. I can tell this is not going to work out.
Yeah. I mean, I've had moments where I'm like, should I sneak out the back?
The answer is always yes, by the way.
If that's your instinct, yes.
That's your instinct. I would follow that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so funny
I did it.
I know, right? It's so funny because when you say it that way, I think a lot of people think that they're good at distilling things, but the way that communication does, it's like this combination of what we've all been talking about, the clarity of the picture and the brevity, right? Like it's the combination of those two things together, as clear as possible and as concise as possible. But sometimes you have to go around in circles to get there. So like when you're listening to someone talk, you're taking in all the information and then it's easier to spit it back at them. But sometimes when we talk out loud, right? Like you'll hear us repeat things in a slightly different way a few times because it's not quite the right landing yet. And then you hear us create the landing in the middle of like external processing. It's so funny. It's so hilarious because we're all going to do it. Like we've all done it already, but we're all going to do it. This whole podcast is going to be just us realizing I just did that communication thing.
I have one. I would like to revise my answer.
Yes, add.
And that is, I want to talk about the fact that I feel like my one communication makes me a not great drafter, but a really excellent reviser. Because I can really get into the weeds on a draft and go in circles and like repeat myself and really get into the weeds. And then in the revision, once I'm clear on what the story is and how it should be going and what I'm trying to do, the revision is where all the magic happens for me. And I don't know if that's true for you guys, but
that is true for me. But how many times have you read a book and gone, okay, you've said, I get it. You said this already. I get it. Because that is like a thing for me. And I'm shocked that I don't do it more, because in the draft I do. Like I'm constantly repeating the point, but I fix it in revision. But yeah, when I read a book, I'm like, okay, I get it. You said it. I get it. We know it.
A high communication editor is literally worth their weight in gold. Like my editor is a high communication, and she's constantly being like, we already know this. We already know this. And I'll be like, oh, thank God, because I just wasn't sure. Right.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I love the fact that even just a skill like that. So like what Sarah had said about being a good reviser, it's not just of your own work either, right? It's of other people's,
Right.
because you can watch how someone says something. And I think with enough perspective, we can do this to ourselves as well, but you can watch how someone says something and say, you could say 4 words and get across the same concept. And so you'd want to pull out all 2 paragraphs and then say those 4 words. And then all of a sudden it's packed with all this meaning, right? And that's what that core of communication is kind of all about for me, is it's the message. What we really are looking for is for the message that's in my brain that's sometimes wordless to get into your brain. And I want to figure out how to do that in the best way possible in the words that I'm using. But I can always tell based on your response or based on sometimes my own wording, I didn't do that. So I need to go back and do that again. So I love that you brought that up about revisions, because I do think that also it's not uncommon for communication people to feel like they have to revise as they write, because they want to make sure that they're saying the things correctly or getting the landing right. And so the tension, then the suspension bridge tension, is I want to write quickly if I can, but I also can't write something that isn't right. RIGHT. So I have to constantly struggle between pushing myself forward and letting myself stick. And I feel like that tension for communications, because we're not going to be the fastest writers often, because we are taking a little bit more time. And I know, like myself, I struggle with that, with not being faster.
That mindset of just just get it out is really hard.
It's so
I mean,
hard.
I find that so I know for a fact that I write shorter than Sarah. My first draft is shorter, and it's usually just the point. That's my first draft. And then like with my latest book that's gonna come out, once I got my editor's notes, I could figure out all of the things and all of like the minor subplots and like even different characters that I needed to add to the love story to like really make it whole and complete and like as satisfying as it could be.
Yep.
Yep.
That's common too, because you essentially got feedback from her,
Mhm.
right? Like, how did it land? She told you, and then you changed it to be what it could be. And that's another big piece of communication, is it's a feedback loop strength. And if we don't take that into consideration, and I know that I've talked to all of you, and probably all of the communications that are listening as well at some point, about talking about your books. So when you get into a point where you're stuck, that sometimes with communication, being able to talk through and see how the places are landing with other people can help us to get unstuck. But all communications I've ever met have a feeling that we talk too much. And so we're often super reluctant to reach out to people and be like, can you help me talk through my book? Because we're like, you don't want to listen to me talk. You listen to me talk all the time. But really,
that's so true. Yeah.
right? Like it can be really frustrating. Have you found a way for yourself to do it without that? Like, do you feel like there's a way, like in revision or anything? I can't get around it for myself.
I can't either.
No, I can't.
I have to talk to somebody, but I am very reluctant. Like I have a group that I meet with once a month for brainstorming, and I am reluctant to pick up the phone and call them in between that month, because I know they're busy, and I know if I get to talking, I could talk for a long time. So I got a lot of words to spin.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think, I mean, I think Sarah, one of the reasons that Sarah and I became close friends is because like I had a sick dog, and she was like one of the only people who was like, I'm going to call you right now on the phone. And I feel like very unmillennial to talk about that, but it's like that being able to talk, even texting is good, but like sometimes it helps just to talk. Yeah. So like that is, I think, realizing that about myself. And also like I come from a family of talkers. Like I talked to my aunt on the phone for like an hour and a half last night, about nothing. So like, I think that's like, it's important to just kind of be like, well, you know what, be confident enough. Like my friends like me well enough to hear my dumb voice, you know?
Yeah, that's good.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around, are there actually people who write a whole book and don't talk to people about it?
Oh, yes.
What?
Yeah. Yeah. So many. In
I
fact,
don't understand how.
so many. In fact, when I bring this up sometimes in Write Better Faster, people will be like, how do you even, I can't even imagine, like, their voice is gonna become part of your book. And I'm like, no,
What?
like, no, it's so different when you have communication, because the feedback process is literally a dialogue.
Yeah.
Like, I can't get really good feedback without someone telling me, and not just what they thought about what I said, but literally just their own thoughts. Like, part of how you know as a communication if what you're saying is correct is the way the conversation moves beyond it changes if you said what you were supposed to say. And so if they get stuck somewhere in the book, that's helpful feedback for me. I don't feel like I incorporate them into my book, or somehow my book isn't mine, or any of that stuff. So it's just fascinating to me how different writers are, where there are people who would be so horrified that a communication would talk to someone else in the middle of their book. And then meanwhile, all the communications are like, how do you not? How do you even write? I don't get it.
So I am a 10 maximizer, and the person who reads all of my books, who is not my editor, but like my person who reads all my books whenever I'm stuck, is a 2 maximizer. And I feel like she's like we are the perfect pair, because she can fully understand, and she's also, I think she's a 1 relator and a 2 maximizer. And so like I think she just like she knows what I'm trying to do. She's intuitively aware of it, and then she can help me make it better.
Yeah.
Which is the goal, right?
That's the goal, right? We want it to be the best it can be. And that's part of why communication and maximizer are power pairs, is because they both have that goal of like, I want the message to be delivered in its best possible way as a communication. And as a maximizer, I get sort of obsessed with success, with things working the way that they're supposed to work. And so that combo is so good. And what I love about it too is that, and not everybody feels this way. I think we all will, but not everybody does. I think my books get better because of the feedback. Like, I'm not sure that I would write even close to as good of a book, especially in the nonfiction arena, if I didn't have people asking me, well, did you mean to say this? Or this is how this came across, or this landed this way. And I'm like, oh yeah, I don't want that. So let's go change that. And I'm like, how do you not? So yeah, I'm with you. I have a hard time understanding how people don't write with feedback.
Well, I published my first book, which is pretty uncommon, but it's because I was in a critique group in RWA. It was a great critique group. I mean, like, people that were they did not cut me one bit of slack, but I had a lot of it written, but went back and rewrote that book as I was getting feedback constantly on it. And I know that's the only reason. That is the only reason that I was able to publish that book. And it, it was a good book. I mean,
it did well.
It was because I had that constant I mean, looking back now, I know that's exactly what it was.
And it plays into your strength. Like, I think this is the important piece to remember about communication. If you don't have communication or strategic potential or significance, you may not incorporate feedback easily or quickly, right? Like, it's easier for a high communication person because I'm used to modifying based on feedback and still keeping my own essence or my own voice. And so it might be just easier for us. So here's an interesting question that I'm dying to ask. There are not many communication writers in the world, which is interesting. And we sort of talked about that earlier. Gallup is always like, oh, communication, you must be a writer. And I'm like, but actually, let me just talk to you about that. 28 out of 34 in occurrence among writers, which is fascinating. But the most common advice I hear about getting faster in writing is dictation. And I actually find as a dictation, and I want to know if any of you are like this, I find that my voice when I speak out loud and my voice when I write as a communication are not the same at all, like not even close. So I have a really hard time dictating, and I'm just wondering if any of you have found that to be true.
Oh, I hate it. I tried it. I dictated like one chapter of one book and I was like, I'm never doing this again. I hate it. I'm talking to myself in my head as I'm writing, but
Yep.
I can't do it out loud. And sometimes I will like I'll kind of like mimic one character's dialogue while I'm writing like a long conversation scene, but that's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Because I live alone and I don't want to seem, you know,
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't
I actually, because I have low focus, I have dictated and gone, I'm just talking and then go, there's a dust bunny under the sofa. Like I can totally get off track. So it's not good.
Me too.
I can't do it. I can't. Words, I think this is a high communication thing for me where words have meaning. So I can't blow through a chapter fast. I'm that writer you were talking about before who has to, I'm always rewriting as I go so that the sentences sound right. And that just doesn't gel with dictation for me at all.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I'm so glad to have that confirmed because I say that to people all the time. I'm like, everybody's like, oh, extroverts and high communication, you should be great at dictating. I'm like, no, awful. I can't do it. And so sometimes just hearing, hey, there's all these great writers out there who are doing their best, who are not dictation people. And so it's possible for you also, if you're listening to this, to not be a dictation person. Like not everybody is the same. And I know that, we say that all the time, so we get used to it, but there's so many people who don't understand that on a fundamental level, that it's possible for you to be really good and also not be able to do something like a tactic like that. So I'm really glad we had that conversation. We alluded to this a couple of times, but communication is not high among the writers that we've tested. We've tested about 5,000 writers at this point. So when we say it's not high, that means that out of the full 34 of occurrence, it doesn't occur commonly, which is very interesting because, of course, the word communication would somehow indicate that because writers communicate, that we should be high in communication. So when you have it, you're going to feel like, I don't see this in my colleagues and friends, right? Because it's not as common. And so we wanted to make sure to do this particular cast specifically for those of us who are wondering why it's not more common. And of course, as we talked about with the authors, it's partly because communication is all about the audience. And some writers do not, in fact, many writers do not think about their audience when they write. They don't think about how things land on their audience. And so that's something that a communication person would excel at. So when we think about how to proceed forward as high communication writers, we want to make sure to look for ways to utilize our high communication in our marketing, our branding, and our sort of external world, the way that we relate to our fans and to our readers. So that's a challenge for us today that we want to encourage you to do. How can you use these traits? How can you become a speaker or a teacher or a leader or a podcaster or a YouTuber? How can you put your high communication on display so that people can connect with you and then come and connect with your books? And so let's just think about that as we continue on in our high communication lives. And if you do not have high communication, but you know someone who does, don't be afraid to ask them to help you with things like your blurbs or your taglines or your branding, because they're going to have a really effective eye for how to help you with that. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the next QuickCast episode. And I want to thank you all for being here today. Please don't forget to check out our Patreon, where we talk a lot about productivity and we talk about just really fun things. We have some live videos that happen there where you can get live coaching from us. In fact, we're starting something new with our topical live videos where we're talking just about one topic live with our coaches for 90 minutes. And we have questions that are submitted, and you can ask those, and we do it live coaching style. And so if you want to come to our Patreon, check out the levels there and look for the one that says topical videos. And that is a place where I think that you would enjoy. So come and join us. We love to have you on the Patreon, and we will see you in the next quick cast. Bye, everybody.